I mean, if you prefer, I can just say hello, goodbye, and let you go and eat your Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I won't keep you for long, but thank you very much for having me. I'm the UK Executive Director of the International Rescue Committee. So we work in 40 different countries worldwide. We work across what we call the arc of crisis. So we're in conflict and crisis zones like Sudan, Gaza now. We're in neighbouring countries that people flee to, so Chad in the case of Sudan, or Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan in the case of the Syrian refugee crisis. We work along some of the migration routes, and then we also work in safe third countries that people are resettled to, and they always consider themselves to be the lucky few that do come to places like the UK and the US and other European countries. We were privileged to be one of the organisations sharing our ideas earlier. So you've heard from my colleagues Emery and Zara already. I won't emulate what they said particularly. What I wanted to do, and it's a tough job, but it's just try and sort of close out what have been a really fascinating and inspiring set of discussions over the last couple of days. I'll avoid the temptation to sort of rehash some of the challenges, the great challenges that face us, and some of the reasons why we're here. I think that's all very clear. And what I'll focus on instead is a question really about what can be done next in this world where more people are forced to flee their homes than ever before, where the conflicts and the crises that are driving them away from their homes are going on for longer and longer. What can we all do to ensure that refugees and the societies and the economies that host them are set up for success? And you've heard lots of good answers to that in the pitches this morning. But I just want to offer 4 overarching pointers, really, as we think about moving forward. So 4 areas I'll briefly touch on, the first of which is services, because it's obviously vital that we design services for refugees that are informed by the best possible evidence of what works, but also that are designed in partnership with refugees, and that's really how we ensure that we get the best outcome. So I'll say a word on that. I want to talk about systems, because just continuing to deliver services within systems that are stretched at best or broken at worst obviously isn't sustainable, and I think we all need to be taking seriously this question of systems change and what can we do to shape and to reform the systems that surround refugees and too often let them down. The third point I'll touch on is sentiment, public sentiment, and I know this has been a really interesting thread of discussion over the last couple of days, because public sentiment so often is negative and fearful, more than it should be, and results ultimately in the wrong government policies, the wrong actions. And I think again we all have a part in trying to shift that. And finally, I'll come back to solutions. Of course, it's very easy to dwell on the problems, harder to identify and work through solutions. But I think that's why this summit has been set up in such a great way to really take us forward to what the solutions are and how we can all be part of those. So a few words about each of those areas. And first, let me talk about services. And I don't mean to suggest that refugees are somehow dependent on service provision, because they're often not, or not for long, and they rapidly become contributors to our societies and our economies, as Danny said this morning. But nevertheless, there can be particular services that are really needed. And we see in our refugee resettlement and integration programmes that getting that right package of support in place early on for new arrivals across language and employment and education and housing and so on really pays dividends later. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep improving the services that refugees receive here in the UK and internationally. And there are just 2 key parts to this, I think, from my point of view. The first is, as I say, designing services based on the best possible evidence of what works. And if that evidence base isn't there yet, then taking real responsibility for making sure that we're learning as we go and sharing out those learnings. And just an example of that, I mean, around the world we run something called a Healing Classrooms programme, which is making sure that children in classrooms are receiving the social and the emotional support that they need given the trauma that they've been through as refugees, on top of the academic learning that's typically offered. And we've seen that work really well in fragile contexts, particularly in parts of the Middle East, but we're taking some of the learnings from that now and seeing how we can deploy them in our work with teachers here in the UK. And it's just been really interesting to build on that evidence base that we've got elsewhere, but also to see how we can refine it and improve it for the UK context. But the second point, I think, on services is the absolutely crucial one, which is about bringing in the refugees who are ultimately supposed to benefit from them, and doing that at the start in terms of designing programmes, but also doing that as you monitor and evaluate along the way. And we try to build that into all of the programmes that we do in the UK, and it actually drives some really interesting outcomes and different types of programming to what we originally conceived, which is exactly as it should be. And I was just talking to a colleague who works with Ukrainian refugee clients here in the UK, and what started out as quite a broad cultural orientation programme there is now really narrowing in on some mental health provision and engagement for our clients, which came very strongly through the feedback that they gave us about our programmes. And so we're tailoring the work accordingly to make sure we're really meeting the needs as defined by the people that we want to benefit from the work that we do. And we're really excited, I think, to see where that takes us. But I'll go on to the second point, which is on systems, because as an NGO, you can devise the best possible services. But as I say, if the systems around refugees aren't working, then your success will be really limited. And so we're always trying to get now into this discipline of asking, is the system working? Can it be reformed? Is a different system needed? And what's our role in all of that? And how can we help drive those necessary changes? And I'll just give one example which I think brings this to life from our global work, which is malnutrition treatment. So there's 45 million malnourished children in the world. Many of them are trapped in conflict and crisis zones, or part of refugee populations or internally displaced populations. And every year, 2 million of those children die. But we have a treatment solution that is 90% effective, something called RUTF, ready-to-use therapeutic food, which is basically a sort of peanut paste. And we know it works, and we have people who are trained in administering it. But it's only reaching 1 in 5 children globally. And the reason for that, as I say, it's not that the treatment solution isn't there, it's not that we don't know how to administer it, but it's that the system around that isn't working. And I'll spare you the details, but essentially in the UN system, children are either classified as moderately acutely malnourished or as severely acute malnourished. And 2 different UN agencies are set up to treat those 2 different types of children. But often in reality, only one of those agencies will be effective. So a severely acutely malnourished child might be treated, but a moderately acutely malnourished child won't be. But if you've got that treatment in there early, you would have stopped them becoming severely acutely malnourished. Or even where those agencies are operational, some of the people that we work with, refugees and displaced populations in particular, aren't able to get to a treatment facility, and there's no way of getting that treatment out into the community. So it's a system that's letting people down. And so we've been asking ourselves, not how do we just keep treating more people, but how do we change this system that doesn't work? And actually through a mix of some pilot programs, and in particular piloting something that we call the simplified protocol, which is basically treating all children through the same simple process, however malnourished they are, and through engagement with some of the key actors in the system, which is not just the UN, but also national and local governments who are ultimately responsible for healthcare for their populations. We're starting to make some headway, but it's a very different way of looking at what is ultimately the same challenge and what the right solutions are in terms of getting food to these malnourished children. So that's systems. And I think, there are so many ways in which systems are letting refugees down. And you can think about the housing system here in the UK that's leaving refugees homeless, or you can think about the World Bank and the way in which it doesn't manage to get its funding into some of the most fragile contexts where people are displaced or living as refugees. Or you can think about the UN's inability to monitor and protect humanitarian access effectively. That, you know, the list could go on, but I think we all need to be ambitious, that we can not only deliver services, but that we can advocate for and be part of that systems change that is ultimately needed to better serve refugees. Let me go to the third point I wanted to make, which is on sentiment and public sentiment, because obviously all of us who work with refugees know that they're incredibly driven and resilient and hopeful people, and yet the dominant voices that you hear in politics and the media are often hostile and fearful, but also based on myths and lies and not on the facts. Each year, we at the International Rescue Committee publish something called an emergency watch list, which is the top 20 crises that we think are most at risk of deterioration in the year ahead. And this year we focused it on, the theme was on myths and some of the myths that dominate the debate about refugees and asylum seekers, and then the reality behind those myths. But just to pull out one or two examples, there's this big myth you hear often that the US and the UK and Europe are already hosting more than their fair share of displaced people, and shouldn't be expected to receive any more. When in fact, of course, at least 3/4 of the world's refugees are in developing countries, which are often fragile in their own right. But this rhetoric is dangerous because it has real world impact. And we see how instead of improving the response to humanitarian crises and working with countries that are hosting the bulk of the world's refugees, we're instead seeing this approach of enforcing border controls and stripping away people's right to seek asylum. And actually, if Western countries are doing this, it then provides cover for others to do it as well. And it's just been interesting watching and sad watching the conflict in Sudan play out and seeing other countries like Egypt shutting their borders as well and thinking, well, if that can happen in Europe, that can happen here. So there's this steady undermining, I think, of some of the really basic protections that refugees need and deserve. And here in the UK, obviously, we see, and I've had conversations about this in the last couple of days, but myths spoken or published most days about people arriving on small boats being illegal, being an invasion, when in fact the right to seek asylum is such a core part of international law. And we've been doing a lot of advocacy around protecting that right to seek asylum and making sure that if you are thinking about how you can discourage people from taking dangerous journeys, you need there to be safe alternatives in place for that to be effective. So we're really seeing play out this risk that hostile political and public narratives intersect and ultimately drive the wrong actions. And here are really, really holding back the government from putting in place effective and humane policies in place for refugees. But I think one thing we can hopefully all take away from this summit are some of the stories that we've heard and the ideas that we've heard from refugees and from organisations that are working with refugees. And ultimately, we're all storytellers. We can all play our part, I think, in changing some of these dangerous narratives that surround refugees. And we can all be out there and correcting misperceptions and spelling out facts and sharing ideas and sharing stories of people like my colleague Zara, who you heard from earlier, who's left Afghanistan and come here and did brilliant things in Afghanistan and is doing brilliant things here. But these are the stories that I think we all have a role in making sure gains some traction and some better public understanding. So finally, and conscious of Ben and Jerry's hanging over me, I'll turn to this fourth point on solutions. And I think, as I say, in a world where the challenges are mounting, it can start to feel impossible and you can start to feel quite stuck. And it's more important than ever that we stay laser-like focused on solutions. And they're out there. And I mean, just to give a few examples, and you've heard lots today, but, we're doing some work in the north of Syria, which is affected by more than a decade of conflict, but also by climate change now. There's increasing prevalence of drought. And we've worked to develop some climate-adapted seeds, but also to work with networks of farmers to ensure that they can better navigate this challenge of climate change on top of conflict. And we're already starting to see some gains there in terms of the availability of nutritious food. There's a bit of work we're getting going with the UK, well, funded by the UK government, which is working with schools in fragile contexts and in places hosting lots of refugees to ensure that ahead of extreme weather events, schools have access to satellite data. They're supported to make adjustments to shift to remote learning or to move their provision to places where communities may need to move. And doing that anticipatory work before a flood or another disaster strikes, we think will make real progress in terms of how, in terms of the continuation of the education provision that does exist. And there's lots more. There's a programme that we're running called Signpost, which gets information, vital information about their rights and the services that are available to them, to refugees. And 40 million people accessed that programme last year. And there's lots that we'll do, I hope, with AI over the next year or two to make that easier to run and easier to access. So there are these proven solutions out there. And the best ones come from refugees and from the refugee communities themselves. And I think we feel a really strong obligation to be a good partner and to help surface and incubate some of those solutions. But sometimes they lack buy-in, sometimes they lack funding, sometimes they just lack awareness. And I think that's why today has been so important, and really the most powerful part of it all is the fact that you all as a community of people are committed to these solutions, and that we've identified lots today that can move forward. So those were the 4 points that really struck me: services, systems, sentiment, and solutions. And I hope that has some resonance for you and helps shape how we think about this moving forward. But huge thank you to the Conduit and the organisers of this fantastic summit, and thank you for having me. And I wish you well for the rest of the day and for the brilliant work that will follow. Thank you very much.